Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here this evening. We are so excited to have you all here. My name is Blanche Brown, and I am the Public Programming Coordinator here at the Library Company of Philadelphia. If you are joining us again, thank you. If this is your first time attending one of our events, welcome. For those who may not be familiar, the Library Company of Philadelphia, founded in 1731, is an independent research library concentrating on American society and culture from the 17th through the 19th centuries. Free and open to the public, the Library Company houses an extensive non-circulating collection of rare books, ephemera, manuscripts, broadsides, prints, photographs, works of art, and I believe a couple pieces of furniture. Our mission is to foster scholarship in and increase public understanding of American history before 1900 by preserving and interpreting the valuable materials in our care. To that end, we host a wide range of free public programming, such as tonight's event. Although, of course, if you are interested in supporting our work, I will be posting a link in the chat. You can make a donation this evening. You can also learn more about membership or even becoming a shareholder. So thank you all. I am very excited to welcome Laura Ping, who just turned on her camera. Hi, Laura. And tonight's event is a fireside chat, and I do want to tell you a little bit about the programming. And I'm just seeing in the chat now, Nicole, yes, the recording will be emailed to everyone either tomorrow or early next week. So if you need to leave early, no worries. And I also encourage everyone to share the recording with friends, colleagues, family. We have a ton of online content now, and yes, recording. So launched in 2020, when the Library Company was forced to close due to COVID-19, our Fireside Chat series continues as a platform that sustains and celebrates our diverse community of fellows, scholars, librarians, readers, and lifelong learners. Each chat highlights the extraordinary work of researchers who have drawn on the rich collections of the Library Company. Laura was a research fellow not too long ago because I remember seeing her in around the reading room. So tonight's chat, the one that wears the breeches, okay. Women's fashion, dress reform, and gender expectations in 19th century America is the third event in our month-long series, Power and Pomp, Fashion History Month at the Library Company. Power and Pomp has been going on all April, every Thursday in April. If you've missed one of the events, you can find them on our YouTube page. And if you are local to Philadelphia, I encourage everyone to come by and check out the mini exhibit currently up in our Logan room. We have a couple items that relate to tonight's talk, a stereograph, as well as, I'm trying to think of the word to define this item. We have, I think, a trade card, a comic Valentine that you may see tonight, who knows. So you can come check those out in person. And we hope you will join us next week for the final event in the Power and Pomp series, Dressing Up, the Women Who Influenced French Fashion, a virtual conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Block from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and our very own Erica Piola, Director of the Visual Culture Program here at the Library Company. So tonight, Laura Ping will share her research with us on the dress reform movement. If you have questions during Laura's presentation, I encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to pose those. You can pose those at any time during the presentation, but we will address them after the presentation has concluded. We will have a Q&A section. You can also put your questions in the chat. That is perfectly fine. And now it is my pleasure to formally introduce Dr. Ping. Laura J. Ping earned her PhD from the Graduate Center, CUNY, in 2018, with a focus on American history and a minor in women's history. Ping is currently a Diamonstein-Spielvogel, and I should have checked with you how to pronounce that, so please do say it once I finish this introduction. Fellow at the New York Public Library and New York City, and will be joining the faculty at Bellarmine University as an assistant professor in August 2022. Congrats to Dr. Ping on that new appointment. Ping's current book manuscript, Beyond Bloomers, Fashioning Dress in 19th Century America, analyzes the cultural and political impact of women's clothing during the long 19th century. And there are some dates to define what that length is, 1789 to 1914. Ping's article, based on this research, A Tale of Two Bloomer Costumes, What Mary Stickney's and Meriva Carpenter's Bloomers Reveal About 19th Century Dress Reform, was published in Dress in 2021, and she is currently writing a co-authored biography of education reformer Catharine Beecher, which is forthcoming from Routledge Press. Dr. Ping, everyone, put your virtual hands together.
Thank you, Blanche. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. It was an honor last fall to be a postdoctoral fellow at the Library Company. The sources there are just so rich. And so I really was able to spend some time delving into things. And I'm excited to share with you guys tonight some of the things I found. Let me just see if I can get this going. Yes, I do believe I am now sharing my screen. Okay. So I'm really honored to be included in Fashion Month. And I'm going to maybe discuss something slightly different than the other presentations from this month, because I'm looking at anti-fashion and anti-fashion through the dress reform movement. So dress reform, the way I always explain it, is it's women in pants. It's a series of movements where women were pushing back against fashionable clothing in order to fight for equal rights, to advocate better health, lots of reasons. So I think that no analysis of 19th century fashion is complete without a discussion of anti-fashion as well. So I just wanted to start with that comic Valentine that Blanche mentioned, entitled The One That Wears the Breeches. And so we can see this very grumpy looking woman with a pair of pants under a caged crinoline. She has a muff, she has a cape, a fashionable bonnet, and she just generally looks sour. So comic Valentines were a genre in the 19th century meant to be funny, but often by our modern standards, quite offensive. And they're interesting because they give us a sense of what was culturally considered to be comical. So in this particular case, the poem underneath the image says, "Oh, it's well they become you, ma'am, and it's well they become, ma'am. You know what I mean, isn't that crinoline? And are they made of bombazine, which was used for mourning clothing? It's well they become you, ma'am." So if you were to say to someone, she wears the breeches, or you wear the breeches, it wasn't necessarily a literal reference to your clothing. It could be, but it was more of an insult. So it was similar to me saying to someone, she wears the pants in the family. So an insult to a woman for stepping outside of her gender roles, and an insult to a man for letting a woman take on that role. So there is a history around women wearing trousers in the 19th century that predates the dress reform movement as an insult for stepping outside of what your acceptable behavior was supposed to be. There's also a history of cross-dressing novels, and I was lucky enough to stumble upon these with the help of Connie King in the reading room when I was at the Library Company. And these are a kick because they're really adventure stories, but also moralistic tales about how women should behave. So typically there are several themes. A young woman is orphaned. She is either completely alone in the world, or she's left in the care of someone abusive. So this could be a stepmother, this could be guardians, but somewhere along the line, she's being devalued and abused. And so she escapes, but in order to fully escape, must don the clothing of men. So this might be to avoid detection. It might be to get a job. And typically, these women end up working as sailors. They're on ships. So for example, the first image, a sketch of the life of Elizabeth Emmons, or the female sailor, is such a story. So these women, once on this ship, must keep up this facade. Usually there's pirates involved. And then there's some heroic act toward the end that results in the woman's gender being outed, and everyone finds out. In The Friendless Orphan, or the story of Sophia Johnson, it's slightly different because she actually joins the colonial army and is fighting in the American Revolution, looking for her brother, who she knows is also a soldier, and she's escaped a terrible caregiver and is looking to reunite with her brother. So in the end, these women are always outed, but they're celebrated for their heroism. And it's a happy ending because they're reunited with family, they've fallen in love and gotten married, they're embraced by a community. But there's this huge emphasis on them being relieved to be able to go back to women's clothing. So after this whole moralistic kind of Cinderella story, it's interesting to me that the authors felt the need to emphasize the reason women wore pants is because they had this extreme situation, and all they really wanted at the end of the day was to return to gender roles and wear long skirts. So against this context, what did women wear during this time period? So in order to make this slide look pretty, I went with the pre-formatted, so they're a little bit out of order. So just bear with me there. But a fashionable woman in the 1840s and 50s would have had many, many layers of undergarments. So the first would have been the drawers, which were her underwear. She then would have worn a chemise, which was a slip. Over that, she would have worn a corset, and that's cinched in the waist. And she would have had a corset cover over the corset because they were difficult to wash. So that would have been something that was cloth that would have absorbed sweat because it was much easier piece to wash. And then petticoats. Now, prior to the invention of the cage crinoline, in order to get that bell-shaped skirt silhouette that we're all familiar with, women had to wear multiple layers of petticoats. So by the time they donned their fashionable dress, they might have 12 to 15 pounds worth of clothing. Now, the cage crinoline in itself was really dress reform because it created this silhouette without having to wear all of these different layers. So your clothing was lighter, it was cooler, but this isn't necessarily a piece that makes it easier to walk because you're still being constricted by this undergarment. So a big part of the dress reform movement is pushing back against the physical restrictions, very literal physical restrictions of this clothing. It's not easy to bend, it's not easy to walk or climb stairs. You really wouldn't have scrubbed the floors in this outfit. And then also the metaphorical restrictions that this clothing represented when it came to gender roles. So 1848 is a significant year in women's history, but in the history of dress reform, because that is the year that women in the Oneida community adopted a reform dress. So Oneida was a utopian community in New York State. Their goal was to combat the sinfulness of mainstream society by creating their own perfect society, and they were looking to eradicate sin. And so one of the criticisms was materialism and focus on fashion. So the leader of the Oneida community, John Humphrey Noyes, in the first annual report of the community, says women's clothing doesn't make sense. It's restrictive, it's not practical. Somebody should think of something better. And he also subtly says, such as the clothing of little girls. That's super simple. And then shortly thereafter, some of the women in his community did indeed create clothing in the style of little girls. So pantalettes under a shortened skirt. So Noyes really wanted it to be clear to the public that the women of the community had designed the outfit and they had chosen to wear it. But the reality is that he had made this very blunt suggestion Perhaps he nudged them. Perhaps it was just a hint and they took the message. But one of the things that characterizes Oneida then are these clothes. And the reason they're wearing this outfit, besides Noyes' suggestion, is that they want to symbolize their separation from mainstream society. But Oneida also gave women labor opportunities that they wouldn't have had in mainstream society. So yes, women did domestic duties, but they also were salespeople. They worked outdoors. They did labor-intensive jobs. And so they needed an outfit that they could physically move in. So we've got two ideas working here. The one is to reject the materialism of mainstream society, and the second is to create something practical. Also in 1848, health reformers adopt an outfit that is trousers and a short skirt. So eventually it modifies and looks a lot like this, but in 1848, the written descriptions are much more like this image that was printed in the Water Cure Journal in 1851. So it's described initially as pants and a tunic. So some sort of shortened garment and trousers. And it is, according to the story, invented at the Glenhaven Water Cure. Water Cure was an offshoot of health reform where they were looking to treat all kinds of diseases with the internal and external use of water. So these are the people that popularized the idea of drinking 8 glasses of water a day, of drinking fresh spring water, of bathing regularly. They also have a lot of ideas about treating disease with water. So you might submerge one part of your body in water and let the other part of your body hang out. You might wrap yourself in wet sheets. But the real mission of health reform and water cure was to try to find alternatives to mainstream medicine that could cure disease. And so they have identified at this point that fashionable clothing is unhealthy. Some of the reasons they say this don't match with modern science, right? They think that your organs are sort of floating in your body because of corsets, but they're not wrong that corsets are damaging the body. And they're not wrong that wearing 12 pounds of clothing is bad for the back. So the story goes that the business partner of the owner of the water cure, Theodosia Gilbert, who had chronic poor health, invented this tunic and trouser combination to allow her to walk more easily, to exercise more easily. Her business partner, James Jackson, then later claims he came up with the idea. But nevertheless, we point to Glenhaven Water Cure as being one of the first places that it's noted a reform dress is being worn. And then in 1851, Elizabeth Smith Miller, the daughter of Gerrit Smith, also adopts short dress and trousers. Now, Miller's story is that she's working in her garden and she gets frustrated with her wet, muddy skirts. And so she cuts them off and puts trousers on for propriety. So what's going on in this period of 1848 to 1851 that all of these people are getting struck by a thunderbolt and consider dress reform to be something they want to pursue? Well, historians have asked this question, and there's really two thoughts. The first is they just all sort of taking the rhetoric of the time and the discussions made by mainstream doctors about the hazards of corsets, decided to modify their clothing. The second is that because the conversation had begun about modifying clothing, everybody took their own inspiration and created something that fit their needs. But I theorize it's a little bit more local than that, because if we look at the geography of the places in New York State where these women are from, and we look at who the men are in their lives, we start to see connections. So Oneida community is run by John Humphrey Noyes. John Humphrey Noyes and the proprietor of Glenhaven Water Cure, James Jackson, know each other. James Jackson is the protege of Gerrit Smith, Elizabeth Smith Miller's father, and Gerrit Smith also knows John Humphrey Noyes. Now, Elizabeth Smith Miller lives very close to where the Oneida community is located. So it seems more likely that rather than this be an accident, there is some sort of conversation happening about dress reform. And I don't mean that in a literal way that everybody sat down and created a plan, but I mean that maybe through even the visuals of the Oneida community wearing this costume in public, it created a conversation amongst other groups about the merits of dress reform. I don't think it was some sort of planned reform, but I do think that Oneida adopting it first created inspiration for people that either had discussed the costume with people from the community or at least seen them wearing the costume outdoors outside of the community. Now, the Bloomer costume, as the reform dress is going to come to be known, really becomes popular because of Elizabeth Smith Miller. So she puts on this outfit for working in her garden, and then she realizes it's so comfortable she wants to wear it all the time. So she wears it on a visit to Seneca Falls to visit her cousin, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, Stanton is enamored with this costume. It seems like it's so much easier to move, and so she creates her own version. So on this same visit, the two of them, now both wearing reform dress, decide to walk into the town of Seneca Falls and just take a stroll. And on that stroll, they meet Stanton's neighbor, Amelia Bloomer. So there's this fabulous statue in Seneca Falls commemorating this meeting. So Stanton and Miller run into Amelia Bloomer. Amelia Bloomer says, "My, what are you wearing?" And they tell her all about this new costume that Miller has designed and how comfortable it is. Now, Amelia Bloomer has been in this printed debate with the editor of the Seneca County Courier, arguing about whether or not women's clothing needs modified. So this is already something that is on Amelia Bloomer's radar. And so she also thinks this is a great idea, and she adopts the outfit. Now, Amelia Bloomer is the editor of a temperance newspaper called The Lily. And so she begins printing in The Lily the story of her adopting this garment and why she thinks it's superior to fashionable clothing. And it's here that we begin to see the political agenda get attached to the reform dress, because rather than just arguing that it's more comfortable and it's healthier and it's easier to work in, Amelia Bloomer starts to argue that in addition to those things, it's also representative of women's equality to men, because now you're not being restricted by this fashionable clothing that makes you seem weak. You can demonstrate your physical abilities and therefore your mental capabilities as well. So Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, is a fan of Amelia Bloomer. He reads about her dress transformation in The Lily, thinks it's intriguing, begins to reprint her writings in the Tribune. The Tribune is then syndicated. So it's through Amelia Bloomer that people around the country start to learn about dress reform. And the newspaper editors mock her and call it the Bloomer costume. So that's where we get the name. So reformers themselves would have called it the reform dress, the short dress, the shorts, but we think of it as the Bloomer costume because of this nickname from the press. So because Amelia Bloomer is now getting more publicity for the cause of dress reform than any of the other factions would have, they're all on board. So John Humphrey Noyes is writing that he greatly approves of this. He is glad that Amelia Bloomer is popularizing or publicizing about the Bloomer costume. He wanted to remind everybody that it started in Oneida, but he's really okay with other people adopting this costume. And that's the same for the water cure people. So these are much more fringe movements than what Amelia Bloomer's involved in. And the water cure community recognizes that she's getting a level of attention they can't match. So they have newspapers, but they're not being as widely read as the newspapers that Amelia Bloomer's articles are being printed in. So they're on board. So we actually in 1851 see this fascinating conversation happening through print between the Water Cure Journal, which is the major publication of the water cure movement, and Amelia Bloomer's Lily. So in The Lily, Amelia Bloomer had published a woodcut of herself wearing the Bloomer costume so that her readers could envision it. And so this is that woodcut. But we see that it's being reprinted in the Water Cure Journal. And the Water Cure Journal is also labeling it the American costume. So the American costume is what health reformers called their version of the reform dress. They wanted to link it to patriotism because they're arguing that if a woman is healthier, she can be a better wife and mother, therefore create better future citizens of the United States. But they obviously have no problems using Amelia Bloomer's image. So they're really piggybacking off of the publicity that she's getting. And so there's this conversation happening between her publication and the mainstream publications and her publication and other reform publications. So for a brief moment in 1851, the Bloomer is popular, what we call Bloomer mania. So not everyone that adopts it is involved in social reform. It actually becomes, I don't know if popular is the right word, but at least reasonably well known in rural areas, such as Wisconsin, where this woman was from. And so for women that are living on farms, on the frontier, crossing the country on the Overland Trail, moving to towns that maybe don't yet have any sort of paved roads and therefore are very, very muddy, the Bloomer costume offers an alternative to fashionable clothing that's a lot more functional. So on one hand, you have all of these reformers. On the other hand, you have people that are wearing it purely because it's functional. But the press is also producing images that suggest this is a fashion. So the intention is never to overthrow fashion. The intention is to simply give women an alternative, but somewhere along the lines that gets a little bit misconstrued in the popular press. So in 1851, Harper's New Monthly Magazine prints this image of a romanticized version of the Bloomer costume and predicts it's going to be the brand new summer fashion. Lithographers also are producing images of the Bloomer costume for sheet music. So sheet music's incredibly popular in this time period. People would buy it relatively inexpensively, and then you could play the piano or your instruments in the house, maybe dance with your family, enjoy some entertainment. So most of this inexpensive sheet music didn't have words. It's not meant to be sung, it's just meant to be played. So the ways that you would create sheet music that would sell well are beautiful images. And so the competitiveness was not necessarily in the creativity of the music, but the creativity of the sheet music cover. And so in this particular instance, we see a cover called The New Costume Polka. So the new costume meaning the Bloomer, and creating again a very beautiful image of a woman wearing a Bloomer costume, other women on the streets wearing Bloomer costumes. So for a moment, it seems like this indeed might be something that has a life of its own. And dress reformers are really trying to make sure that as many people as possible know about this movement. And so in 1851, there's also the World Exhibition in London at the Crystal Palace. And so a group of American dress reformers go to London, not necessarily to create an exhibit at the Crystal Palace, but to advertise the Bloomer costume. And they meet with English reformers who are also interested, and they set up a series of lectures to be held during that same time period. And they stand outside of the Crystal Palace and they hand out flyers. And this is where it all starts to go downhill, because there's such a curiosity for people that are at this exhibition that they're mobbed by crowds. The police have to show up and escort some of these women away from the Crystal Palace. The venues they're able to rent are not in good neighborhoods in London. And although they're selling out every night, most of the people that come to hear these women speak about the merits of the Bloomer costume are men that are looking to heckle them. And then the comic press gets involved. So one of the leaders of this movement to caricature the Bloomer costume is the London magazine Punch. So in the upper right, this is an illustration from Punch. So entitled Bloomerism in American Costume, we see that these women are very crude and masculine in their depiction. The Bloomer costumes are exaggerated. The women have a very pinched, angry face. They're smoking. They're juxtaposed to these fashionable, beautiful women that have soft features. So the message really is that a woman would only be interested in this costume if she's already ugly, because it is also an ugly costume. And that's going to be a trope that's going to follow the women's rights movement. The idea that you would only be a feminist if you're too unattractive to get a husband, because otherwise you would be happily married with children. So this is a particularly telling illustration. We, of course, have little boys that are throwing balls at them. And we see in the bottom left, it gets reprinted in America under the title Two of the Females. So now they're insinuating that these women may be intersex, but it's also interesting that this is a direct copy of the Punch cartoon. And this is not the only cartoon from Punch that gets reprinted in America and published and circulated. So we have all of these different print conversations happening around dress reform. Conversations within the periodicals of the reformers, conversations between mainstream newspapers who are sympathetic to reforms, and now a conversation, an international conversation within the comic press ridiculing the Bloomer costume. So this takes off in the United States and really has a life of its own. So now the Bloomer is linked with anyone or anything transgressive. So there's already a standard for mocking African Americans in these caricatures, especially when it comes to fashion. The left side photo is, or image is, a depiction of the Black dandy. The idea being that a free African American would want to emulate white fashions, but not have the knowledge to do so well. So therefore would look ridiculous. And this fear that there would be interracial relationships if the Black community was too empowered finds its way into all kinds of illustrations. Well, the Bloomer then just gives them more fuel for this ridicule and method of social control through caricature in depicting African-American men and white Bloomer wearing women. So the picture on the right is an interesting example of this, because the text describes that this woman is an abolitionist, which empowers the idea that if you give women too much political power, then they're going to do all kinds of crazy things like become social reformers. Abolitionists are dangerous. And if you give an abolitionist too much power, they'll free the slaves. And if you free the slaves, then what happens next? But a second textual description also goes back to that idea that this woman is wearing the breeches or wearing the trousers, thereby emasculating the man that she's accompanying. So it's not necessarily that abolitionists were wearing the Bloomer costume on a wide scale as much as this is being used as a tool against the social reform community by caricatures, by artists of caricatures. We also see this in depictions of Black women. So I'm going to start with the image on the right because it's a little bit earlier, and I know you can't see it in super detail, but this is entitled Bloomerism in Practice, the Morning After the Victory. And if you look at the back of the image, we have two Bloomer wearing women. The white woman is saying no more cooking and cleaning, and the African-American woman is saying no more masters and mistresses. And so that is really suggesting that if you give women the power for the vote or the power to wear pants, you're also opening up a Pandora's box that could lead to the freeing of the slaves, could lead to African Americans not wanting to work for white people. And of course, then we have the woman smoking as well. So that's taking on a masculine trait. The image on the left is from a little bit later, but this is definitely an anti-suffrage, anti-women's organization picture. Cirrhosis, which is what the title is, the Colored Cirrhosis, was one of the first women's clubs. And so again, we see this idea that the bloomer is exaggeratedly short, the woman doesn't know how to wear it properly. And so using the bloomer as a tool to feed into this concern that empowering one group in society might lead to an overthrow of all of the hierarchy. Now, in reality, African-American women don't want to wear the bloomer. I found a newspaper account from the Philadelphia Inquirer describing a Black woman wearing a bloomer costume. So it's possible that some people, especially if they were involved with reform communities or abolition communities, may have tried it temporarily. But most of the descriptions of anyone of color wearing a bloomer costume are satirical. The exception is that Charlotte Fortin, later Grimke, who is an education advocate and an abolitionist in Philadelphia, does actually own one, but she hates it. So she describes in her diary wearing it to pick cherries out of a cherry tree. She doesn't want to wear her nice clothes to climb a tree. And then also wearing it to a costume party, but feeling ridiculous and really not enjoying it. So despite the implication from these artists that African-American women may be interested in jumping on the dress reform bandwagon, it's really not something that happened, partially because while women's rights reformers are using dress reform as a way to assert their voices and to be political, for these women, it was fashion that was political, because being able to wear mainstream fashion implied that they had a choice for their clothing, which an enslaved person wouldn't, but also communicated respectability. Gender also goes under attack. Again, this idea that the world could be turned upside down if you let women wear pants. So if women are wearing pants, does that mean men are wearing skirts? And if women are wearing pants, do they want to go out into the world and work? And if that's the case, then who's going to take care of the home? And this particular caption is a policeman is stopping this man in a dress. He's saying to him, why are you wearing this outfit? And he says, well, my wife, presumably this is the wife on the other side, took all my pants. So this is the only thing left to wear. So again, the idea that she's usurping his manhood. Now, after these cartoons start to come out, the women's rights group actually abandons the bloomer costume. They fear that it's detracting from their causes, especially the vote, and they don't want to risk one of these more important to them causes for the sake of dress. They feel like if they can get the vote, then later they can enact all kinds of legislation, including maybe the right to wear whatever clothing you want. And so it's really the health reformers that keep dress reform going. So on the left-hand side here, we have James Jackson, who was the proprietor of Glenhaven and claimed that he had invented the short dress and told his business partner about it. His wife, Lucretia, wearing the American costume. Jackson's second business partner, Harriet Austin, wearing a version of the American costume, and then Lydia Sayre Hasbrook, who also had a newspaper dedicated purely to dress reform. And so it's not through the politics at all, it's through the health reformers that we actually see elements of dress reform ideology becoming mainstream. So for these groups, they are arguing that dress reform is something that can be worn in private. One of the controversial elements of the bloomer costume for women's rights advocates was their assertion that it should be worn in public all the time. Health reformers back off on that, and they say, you know, we can wear this in private, and then it's about health and it's not about upsetting gender roles. And then they go a little bit further. They start to say, you know, this can also make you a better wife and helpmate to your husband. It can make you a better housekeeper. It can make you a better mother. And so the way in which they keep dress reform going is not just by offering it in the privacy of their sanitariums, but by arguing that it actually is going to help a woman be better at her traditional roles. So where we think of the Bloomer costume as being exceedingly radical, and it is radical, and these health reformers are radical by the standards of the time, in many ways, their promotion of dress reform reiterates the conservative traditional values that are attached to gender roles. And their emphasis on exercise is the thing that really gives them a legacy, because you end up with a combination of education reformers who are already pushing for physical education in schools, becoming interested in health reform as well. So a good example of this is Catharine Beecher. Catharine Beecher went to water cure institutions every year. She also believed that physical education should be included in schools. So based on what she learns at the water cure sanitariums, she writes books on physiology and calisthenics, and suggests that women adopt a Bloomer-like costume for exercising. Dio Lewis, who is an exercise proponent, who creates gymnasiums throughout the East Coast and lectures on physical education and is really responsible for physical education being part of women's colleges, is interested in health reform. And it's because of this popularization of the ideologies of dress reform through physical education that we end up later with fashion designers who are creating underwear reform. So from the 1860s really to the end of the century, you have certain people arguing that the reason the Bloomer costume failed is because it's ugly. And that instead, what women needed was undergarments that would relieve the pressure put on a body by the corset or by heavy underskirts, so that all of the health benefits are coming from your undergarments and you can still put on your fashionable dress. And so it's your knowledge that you're practicing dress reform, not the world's knowledge. So one of these women was Madame Demarest, who created a series of pulleys and elasticized corsets that offered women this alternative to fashionable clothing. She's interesting because she has a newspaper or a catalog really called Madame Demarest's Mirror Fashions, where she is promoting her own fashion designs and clothing that's very, very popular and on trend. But then at the same time, these undergarments that are created in line with the principles of dress reform. We have Annie Genesis Miller, who is also a fashion designer, and she's very much identified as a dress reformer. But again, she's not pushing for Bloomer costumes. She's pushing for loose bodiced dresses, something that's more in line with what was going on in England with the pre-Raphaelite movement, which in the 1850s was a group of artists who got together and argued that fashionable clothing in creating the hourglass silhouette was manipulating women's body into a shape. And that was unnecessary because women's natural shape was beautiful. And so they create a series of very flowy gowns that are meant to hug a woman's curves instead of try to create curves. So Annie Genesis Miller incorporates those ideas with the principles of dress reform to create her own version of dress reform garments. Perhaps the most famous application of the Bloomer costume, however, is the bicycle. So we all get we have images of the bicycle bloomers. And from what I can tell, they really weren't worn that often. Most women would have worn slightly shorter skirts instead of the actual bloomer. But because the bicycle bloomer is being advertised as an accessory, bicycling catalogs are depicting women in the bicycle bloomer, as well as catalog companies like Sears and Roebuck, who are selling both bicycles and bicycle clothing. So ultimately, what was once anti-fashion comes full circle and becomes fashion. It just depends on what version of the clothing you're looking at. If we're talking about the bicycle is being, maybe the clothing is being promoted as fashion, although maybe not worn by most people. But most definitely the alterations in corsets that we see, especially when we get to the early 20th century, really illustrates that while dress reform has been treated as a failure by historians, the individual movements may not have accomplished their goals, but ultimately, through health arguments, the ideologies of dress reform ended up having quite a long life. And I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions, so I'm going to stop us there.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was really fascinating. I'm going to begin by asking the first question that popped up in the chat. What was the intention of the comics in England giving a bad reputation to the Bloomers?
What was the intention? So it's twofold, really. So part of it is an anti-American sentiment. They are really like, there's a trend in Britain at that time to make fun of America and make fun of American costumes. So part of it is this anti-American rhetoric, like, look how ridiculous they are that the women dress like this. But part of it was attacking something that was linked to women's rights and something that was linked to pushing beyond the acceptable gender roles, but also the way a woman is supposed to look.
Thank you. I also wanted to go back to a point you were making about the health reformers promoting dress reform as a way to help women fulfill traditional roles. Mm-hmm. Can you share any like specific examples they gave to that? Like, what did you read about that?
Yeah, so women, I'm going to give just a little bit of background as well. Women didn't, run their households and scrub their floors in fashionable gowns. They wore something typically called the Mother Hubbard, which is based on the nursery rhyme Mother Hubbard. If you think back to those children's books, they all have these illustrations of this woman wearing a kind of a long nightgown. And that's what these dresses looked like. And so they're nicknamed Mother Hubbards. And those were typically work dresses. And we don't have a lot of information about them simply because women would wear them into pieces and then rip them up as rags. Women might also wear something called a wash dress, which would be a little bit shorter skirt so that when you're doing the wash, you're not dragging your skirt through the wet grass or wherever you're washing. So women did have work clothes in place. But the health reformers are arguing that what they've come up with is better. So in the Water Cure Journal and in these different publications, they're specifically writing, and I think I have some quotes, they're specifically writing that women, it's your duty to be your husband's helpmate. And they're really emphasizing the ways in which it's a woman's job to support her husband. And they're saying, and if you wear this, you'll be a better helpmate. They're not necessarily giving examples. They're just making the connection. They are giving a lot of emphasis to being able to take walks and be physically healthier. And if you're physically healthier, then you can take better care of your children. But they're also telling people you need to be a good example for your children. And so if you can demonstrate to your kids what it's like to live a healthy life and what it's like to be a healthy person, then not only are you more capable of training them to be good citizens, they will grow up and be good citizens. So it is all very vague. It is very vague. They're sort of instructions. They're not necessarily giving you an ABC about how this works. They're just really kind of, I think, hitting women where they think they'll capture their attention.
Thank you for that. And April Logan asks in the chat, great talk, Dr. Ping. When you mentioned the first women's club mocked in the 1869 Harper's Weekly, did you mean white or Black women's clubs? And then a second question from April, when were the cross-dressing novels, The Female Sailor and The Friendless Orphan, published? So yes. A two-hitter there.
Cirrhosis, and I always want to say like psoriasis or get it wrong. So if I'm butchering the pronunciation, forgive me. Cirrhosis was the first white women's club. So that image has a whole other connotation when they say the collared cirrhosis, because it was actually a white women's club. And these weren't poor women. These were middle-class women. Mostly their mission was education equality, and they were really interested in labor equality, how to get women equal pay for equal work. And like a lot of these clubs, they had a lot of good ideas, but not a lot of practical application to them. So this would be something where women would have tea together and they would discuss what they sort of thought social problems were and how to fix it. So the idea that you've got a Black woman being depicted wearing a Bloomer costume, but being linked to a white women's club that didn't wear dress reform just kind of shows us how the press takes all of these things that are transgressive and lumps them in together. And even though the Bloomer costume is not worn by women's rights advocates after about 1855, for the rest of the century, if they wanted to mock suffragists or women's rights advocates, or even women that they just thought were stepping outside of their acceptable roles, the press would put them in bloomers. So there's even an image of, it's Emily Blackwell or maybe her sister, who were doctors, wearing Bloomer costumes, which they didn't do. They actually both were against the Bloomer costume for not being feminine. But it's the idea that it's sort of a badge, like something that you don't need to caption. But if you put a woman in a Bloomer costume or put someone next to a Bloomer costume, you're automatically identifying them as a problem. The novels, the cross-dressing novels, were largely from the 1830s and 40s. And then the Bloomer novels start coming out right around the 1851 through the 1860s, as Bloomer costume is getting a lot of publicity in the press.
Quick follow-up question from me on that. Did the Bloomer novels sort of follow that same moralistic arc?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. One of the funnier excerpts from one of them was this woman is really interested in finding a husband, and the Bloomer is not a caricature. She's literally like someone they see on the street, but they're talking about how much they hate Bloomers. And this woman says, when I see someone on the street, my first thought is, are you handsome and are you free to marry? Because I'm looking for a husband, and I hate a Bloomer because I see them down the street and I think, ooh, who's that? And when she gets closer, I realize it's just a woman wearing pants, and it was a waste of my time. So it's used as sort of comic relief. The other kind of theme is that a woman might be engaged and be wealthy and have a lovely family. And when she decides to be radical and put on the Bloomer, she loses it all. And then eventually comes to her senses. And when she puts long skirts back on, everyone returns and she's in good favor. The only pro-Bloomer novel that I found is Louisa May Alcott's Rose in Bloom, which is a story about a young girl who goes and lives with her uncle and her aunt, and the uncle's a doctor. So he's really into health reform. And he suggests she wear a Bloomer costume, but that's also reflective of Alcott's own role in social reform.
Yes, I could say more about that, but it is not me time. And so I pose Sally Mista's question, and I hope I'm saying your last name correctly, apologies if I am not, was the reformer movement in America a national phenomenon, or was it confined to the East Coast major cities?
Mostly East Coast major cities, but because people are going west, we do see a reasonable amount, and it's hard for me to tell like how many people would have worn it. The answer is not very many, but there are a reasonable amount of letters to the editor coming in to these reform newspapers, especially the Water Cure Journal and the Lily, that are describing working on a farm, living on a farm, and it's not political. These women are saying things like, I put it on and then I went and mucked the pigs, and it was so much easier than when I'm trying to wear long skirts. So they're getting a lot of positive feedback from farm women that are crossing the Overland Trail, women that are living on the frontier. But I still think that it was a minority, not very many women, because a lot of them are also explaining that the importance of these newspapers is that they feel like they have a long distance community, because they might be the only one in their town that wears a Bloomer and they're being made fun of it for it. or their family disapproves. So it's a very small number of people that are wearing the bloomer. But I think it is interesting that there was a need for, at least for some women, to have options. And so the situational dress reformers, the ones that are saying, well, I'm not going to wear this forever, but crossing the prairie is hard work and I don't want to drag skirts, or, I'm not wearing this to church, but I will wear it to do my chores on the farm. I think that's a really important element of the story.
Absolutely. And it does bring me back to a question I had when you were going through the sort of clothing that the dress reform was pushing against with the 12 pounds and all of that. And it does seem that the dress reformers are coming from middle to upper class. And I was just curious if working class women were also wearing that many layers and wearing that type of clothing that was so difficult to move in. If you speak to that briefly.
Yeah, so middle-class women are thinking, so okay, let me start over. Working class women wouldn't have worn that many layers to go, say, work in the factories. It's just not practical. Whether they wore corsets, I'm not entirely sure. They would have, I'm sure, because it's really, there's no brasiers at this time period, nothing like that. So for propriety, they probably would have had corsets on. But one of the things that is really empowering in the 1850s that works against the bloomer costume is that there's a certain democratization of fashion going on, meaning that there's a large secondhand clothing industry. And there's also a lot, it's not mass production yet, but it's a lot easier to go buy a dress or buy a corset than it would have been in previous centuries when you had to make your own. So it's not quite what's going to be in the early 20th century, but we're starting to see some mass production of women's outfits. And so because you can buy something that is maybe made of cotton instead of silk, but has the correct silhouette, working class women are able to emulate middle class and upper class women. And there's actually resentment from the elites coming from this, saying, on Sunday, you can't tell who's a maid because it's everybody's day off and everybody's wearing their best outfits. So because fashion is such a powerful tool of class status and respectability for these women, and this is true of immigrant women as well as poor white women, as well as free Black women, the option to wear something that looks fashionable, that is fashionable, is empowering. That in itself is power. Where the women's rights reformers see fashion as restricting their power, that's because of their privilege, their class status. And they don't understand why everybody doesn't feel that way. So they try to convince working class women to adopt the bloomer costume. They're not as interested in African American women, although they do try to convince Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, because they are middle class Black women that are famous. So the idea is if they could get them to wear it, maybe it would have more credibility. And those two women are basically like, no, I don't think so. Sojourner Truth is just like, absolutely not. That thing is ugly. I'm not wearing it. And Harriet Tubman is like, no, they say it reminds them of their slave clothes. I think Harriet Tubman does on some of her treks with the Underground Railroad wear something similar to the bloomer, but it's not the same thing as being a dress reformer. And so for poor women, they just want nothing to do with it. And so the dress reformers interpret that as poor women just being too ignorant. So they see it as their duty. And this is something they explicitly say in their newspaper articles, is they need to be a good example for poor women, so that eventually poor women will see the light and say, oh, well, now I understand and I'll adopt dress reform. But there are efforts at the hands of bosses, like factory owners, to get their working women to wear bloomer costumes because they think they can move in and out of the machinery easier than they can with full skirts. And so there are situations where the bosses are telling these groups of women in New York City, you're going to start wearing this, and the women refuse and the women get fired. There's, instances where in Lowell, they try to bribe the women to wear the bloomer costume and it fails. So this is a very middle class, white, like reform-minded movement. It's not something that appeals to most people. And that's largely because of the power of fashion. But that's why it's so interesting to me that when it starts to, the ideas get adapted into underwear reform, then it's successful. It's that these pants and the idea of an outfit that's ugly really works against them. And something that might make you an outsider really works against them, as opposed to something that really is about comfort and doesn't change how well you conform to standards of beauty.
Oh, thank you. That was very helpful. And we have a few more questions. Sandra Myers asks, did pre-Raphaelite dressing get popular with any segment of American women?
Not like it did in Europe. So it's much more of a European movement. So pre-Raphaelites are the 1850s, and then there's a resurgence in the 1880s in Europe that they call the aesthetic movement, and it's very much based on the pre-Raphaelites. In America, it's called the artistic movement, and it has some popularity in New York and Boston, and technically tea dresses, which were really popular in the 1890s and are essentially like oh, they're kind of like fancy bathrobes, really, or like trying to remember what the bathrobes my grandma wore that like zipped up, like it didn't tie, it like zipped, house coats. They're fancy versions of that. So they're really like beautiful and embroidered and nice, but they're meant for lounging. Those are technically dress reform garments, but they're also based on this artistic aesthetic movement.
And another, this will probably be our final question for the evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Ping. Besides the bloomers, do you know if there's any other piece of cloth that was considered a controversial item within the reforming movement?
Well, some of it had to do with colors. So trying to think of a controversial clothing within the reform movement. I mean, so reformers are just generally rejecting fashionable clothing in general. And I know that like sometimes really bright colors were considered popular. And so reformers chose to wear darker colors because they thought they were more serious. So they thought that people would take them more seriously if they were wearing darker colors. And then of course there's Quaker clothing, which was again very modest and somber colors, but I think not to the same degree as the Bloomer costume, not to that same degree. But there's a lot of ways in which women used clothing as a political expression and really like used their bodies as political expressions. You know, some reformers cut their hair short, again, as a challenge to what they saw as frivolities that serve no purpose. So there are many different ways that reformers use their bodies to politicize their messages.
Fascinating. Thank you, Laura. I can't help but like think that, you know, we're still using our bodies as like vehicles for political messages. And that's like a very resonant point to end on. Thank you so much for your time and for presenting your work tonight. And thank you everyone for attending. I hope everyone has a wonderful night, and this talk will be sent around to everyone who had to leave early in the next couple days. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you.